She knelt in the dust of her root cellar, the lantern light turning the beads of sweat on her brow to tiny, fleeting pearls. Before her sat the crate, and from it rose the ghost of summer, a scent of honey and rot so thick it was a weight in the air. The whole town of Providence agreed Elspeth Howell had lost her mind. Not a slow, gentle unraveling, but a clean snap like a thread pulled too taut. To pay $3 hard-earned dollars for a crate of hail-split peaches, their skins pocked and broken, their flesh weeping a sticky, desperate sweetness onto the splintered wood, it was madness. Silas Croft, whose store was the town's heart and its ledger, had said as much, his voice loud enough for the whole porch to hear. A fool's bargain, he declared, pocketing her money with a pitying shake of his head. Might as well have thrown it in the creek, now, in the cool, earthy dark, with the judgment of the town ringing in her ears. Elspeth ran a hand over a bruised peach. It was soft, yielding, on the very edge of becoming nothing. And yet, beneath the ruin, she could feel a warmth, a stubborn pulse of life. The arithmetic of it was stark and unforgiving. She had the crate of ruined fruit, a dwindling sack of flour, half a bag of sugar, and the months stacking up toward winter like firewood. She was one person alone, a young woman who had inherited a small, sun-beaten patch of land that had broken her father's back and then his heart. The town watched her with the kind of concern that felt sharp to the touch, waiting for her to fail, to pack up, to become someone else's problem. They did not know about the quiet, fierce thing that lived in her, the part that looked at what was broken and saw only the work that needed doing. 3 months earlier, the sky had turned the color of a fresh bruise. The clouds gathered not with the gentle promise of rain, but with a clenched, silent fury. Then the hail came. It was not the small, stinging shot of a common storm. It was the size of marbles, then robin's eggs, falling with a sound like 1,000 hammers on a tin roof. It fell for 11 minutes. When it was over, a strange, glittering silence descended. The world was white and shredded. Men stood on their porches and looked out at their fields, and the hope drained from their faces, leaving them old and gray. The corn was stripped to ribbons. The tomatoes were pulp, and the peaches, the pride of the valley, hung on their branches like shattered ornaments, bleeding juice onto the leaves. The next day, the air of defeat in Providence was as thick as the mud on the road. At Croft's Mercantile, the mood was funereal. Farmers who had been counting on their harvest now counted their debts. Silas Croft held court from behind his counter, a grim-faced king of necessities. A total loss, he announced to anyone who would listen. Won't be a single peach worth selling this year. Not a 1-inch, that was when Elspeth saw it, shoved into a corner by the back door. A large shipping crate filled with the casualties from a Miller orchard up the ridge. They were a disaster. Split, bruised, gashed to the stone. Most people saw garbage. Elspeth saw the sun and the rain and the work that had gone into growing them, and a deep, resonant ache started in her chest. She saw a glimmer of what might be saved. "What will you do with those, Mr. Croft?" she asked, her voice quiet in the loud room of men's despair. Croft followed her gaze and snorted. "Hog feed, I suppose. If the hogs will even have them, I'll give you $3 for the crate," she said. The room went silent. Every eye turned to her. It was an audacious, nonsensical offer. $3 was a week's worth of flour and salt pork. It was the price of a good axe handle. Croft's eyes narrowed, searching for the trick. Finding none, his face relaxed into a mask of smug pity. $3? For that mess. He looked around the room, sharing the joke. "Well, it's your money to waste." Elspeth, he took her coins, his hand closing over them as if she'd just paid him for a lesson she was about to learn the hard way. As she arranged for young Leo Hemlock to help her get the crate onto her small buckboard, she could feel their stares on her back. She heard the whispers. Poor thing, her father's grief finally took her wits. She did not look at them. She kept her gaze fixed on the crate of ruined fruit, her hands steady, her face as still as a stone in a riverbed. She had made her bargain. Now the work would begin. She hauled the heavy crate from the buckboard herself, the splintered wood digging into her palms. Her small cabin, 2 rooms of sturdy pine her father had built smelled of dust and loneliness. The crate sat on her porch like an accusation. For a long moment, she simply stood before it, the sheer scale of the rot and the waste threatening to overwhelm her. Doubt was a cold, creeping thing. The town's judgment was not a distant echo, but a voice inside her own head. What had she done? She had traded precious security, however small, for a box of decay. Her hands, already calloused from tilling her small vegetable garden and mending fence, felt clumsy and unequal to the task. She took one of the worst peaches, its skin split wide, and brought it inside. It was then she knew she needed counsel, not from the man at the mercantile who saw only loss, but from someone who understood the deeper alchemy of the earth. She walked the half-mile to the Gable farmstead. Mrs. Annalise Gable was a woman made of earth and iron, with hands that had known the soil of 2 continents. She had come from the old country with her husband, now long buried, and a collection of seeds and wisdom that the people of Providence found both strange and intimidating. She was Elspeth's only friend, if a woman of 70 and a girl of 22 could be called such. Mrs. Gable was in her garden, humming a tune in a language Elspeth didn't know, her back ramrod straight as she staked a wayward tomato vine. She looked up as Elspeth approached, her eyes, the color of faded denim, missing nothing. Elspeth held out the ruined peach. "They say I'm a fool," she said, the words coming out flatter than she'd intended. Mrs. Gable took the fruit, her touch surprisingly gentle. She turned it over and over, her thumb tracing the jagged line of the hail split. She brought it to her nose and inhaled deeply, closing her eyes. A small, slow smile touched her lips. "Ah," she said, her voice a low rumble, thick with the accent of her homeland. "The storm marks the skin, Elspeth, not the heart." She looked directly into Elspeth's eyes, her gaze steady and clear. "God does not waste the bruised thing. Only people do." The words landed in the quiet air and settled into Elspeth's soul, a balm and a command. Mrs. Gable led her into her kitchen, a room that smelled of dried herbs, yeast, and beeswax. "You must work fast," she instructed, her voice all business now. "The rot will not wait. Cut away the bad. Cut deep. Be ruthless. What is left will be the sweetest part because it has struggled. The sugar is concentrated there." She went to a small, precious tin on her shelf and measured out a half-cup of dark, fragrant powder. "Cinnamon," she said, pouring it into a twist of paper for Elspeth. "And a little nutmeg if you have it. The spice helps what is lost. It reminds the fruit of the son it knew." She pressed the paper into Elspeth's hand. It felt like a sacrament. "And jars. You will need every jar you have. Boil them until they scream. An unclean jar will ruin everything." Elspeth walked back to her cabin, the weight in her chest replaced by a thrum of purpose. Mrs. Gable had not given her magic. She had given her a map. She had confirmed the faint hope that had prompted the mad purchase in the first place. The work was not to fix what was broken, but to honor what had survived. That night, her cabin was transformed. She built up the fire in her cast-iron stove until it glowed a fierce, steady red. She hauled water from the well, bucket by bucket, her shoulders aching with the familiar strain. She washed every jar she owned, canning jars from her mother, old jelly jars, even a few thick glass bottles, and set them in a vast pot of water to boil. The air grew thick with steam, clinging to the windows and making the small room feel like the inside of a lung. Then she turned to the peaches. It was a battle. Her knife became an extension of her will. The arithmetic was brutal. For every peach, she would carve away a third, sometimes half, tossing the bruised, brown flesh into a bucket for the compost heap. The good flesh, a vibrant, impossible sunset orange, went in her largest stew pot. The pile of discarded pieces grew into a mountain. The pile of saved fruit seemed pitifully small. Her hands were sticky, her arms slick with juice up to the elbows. The sweet, cloying smell of decay was everywhere, but beneath it, another scent was rising, the clean, bright fragrance of raw, perfect peach. The work went on for 3 days and 3 nights. Elspeth moved as if in a trance, fueled by coffee, stale bread, and the relentless ticking of a clock she felt in her bones. The rot would not wait. The town of Providence slept, convinced of her folly, while she waged her quiet war against decay. Her small kitchen became a steamy, fragrant crucible. The process was methodical, a ritual of salvation. Sort, Washington cut, discard, keep, over and over, her knife flashing in the lamplight. The mountain of peels, stones, and bruised flesh grew outside her back door, a testament to her ruthlessness. The pot of saved fruit, meanwhile, slowly filled. When she had worked through the entire crate, she stood back and surveyed the result. She had a single, massive pot of perfect diced peach flesh. It was less than she had hoped, but more than she had feared. It was enough. Now came the alchemy. Into the pot went the sugar, handful by handful, until the arithmetic felt right in her gut. She added the juice of 2 precious lemons she'd been saving, and then Mrs. Gable's gift of cinnamon. As the mixture began to heat, a new scent filled the cabin, chasing away the last ghosts of rot. It was a smell of pure, concentrated summer, of sun-warmed fruit, of caramelized sugar, of warm spice that spoke of distant lands and cozy hearths. It was the smell of hope. She stood over the bubbling pot, stirring with a long wooden spoon, her face flushed from the heat. The peaches broke down, releasing their pectin, the liquid thickening from a watery juice to a heavy, glossy syrup. She watched the color deepen from pale orange to a rich, burnished amber. It was beautiful. The most difficult part was the canning. The jars, screaming hot from their boiling bath, had to be filled with the molten preserves, their rims wiped clean, the lids sealed tight. Her fingers, clumsy with exhaustion, fumbled with the hot glass. She burned her thumb twice, the sharp pain a reminder of her focus. But one by one, she filled them. Each sealed jar was a small victory, a jewel of captured sunlight. She held the first one up to the lantern. The light shone through the glass, illuminating the chunks of peach suspended in the amber jelly. It looked like something precious, something found. When the last jar was sealed and cooling on her counter, a row of 37 gleaming soldiers, silence fell upon the cabin. The stove ticked as it cooled. Elspeth sank into a chair, her body a single, profound ache. Her hands were stained brown from the peach juice, the skin around her nails raw. She looked at the row of jars, and then at the empty crate on her porch. She had done it. She had taken the town's pity and Silas Croft's scorn and transformed it into 37 jars of sunlight. She kept her success secret. She washed the stickiness from her floors, aired out the cabin, and moved the jars down into the cool, dark earth of her root cellar. She stacked them carefully on a wooden shelf behind the potatoes, a hidden treasure. It was her own private knowledge, a secret kept like a coal banked low under ash, waiting for the right moment to be coaxed back into flame. The town saw her go about her usual chores, mending her fence, tending her garden, and they saw nothing different. They saw the tired, quiet young woman they had always seen, and they assumed the lesson of the peaches had been a harsh one. They thought she had failed, and for now, Elspeth was content to let them. Weeks passed. The heat of late June settled over the valley. The memory of the hailstorm faded, replaced by a new and more insidious worry. It had not rained since that day. The sky remained a hard, indifferent blue, the sun a relentless hammer. The creek that bordered Elspeth's property shrank, leaving cracked mud banks where there had once been a gentle flow. The corn in the fields, what was left of it, began to yellow at the edges. Elspeth worked her small garden, hauling water from a well until her back screamed in protest. She saw the worry on the faces of her neighbors when she went into town for supplies. Their mockery of her had faded, replaced by a preoccupied dread. They had bigger problems now than Elspeth Howell's poor judgment. It was during this time that Leo Hemlock began to appear at her fence line. He was a boy of 10, with straw-colored hair and the perpetual silence of an overlooked child. His father was a proud, hard man who had lost half his crop in the hail and was losing the other half to the drought. Leo was drawn not by conversation, but by the faint, lingering scent of cinnamon and sugar that still clung to Elspeth's cabin. He would stand at the fence, not speaking, just watching her work. Elspeth was guarded at first. She was accustomed to being alone, and the presence of another person felt like an intrusion. But she saw the hunger in the boy's eyes, a hunger not just for food but for purpose. He was a child adrift in a world of adult anxieties. One afternoon, she walked over to him, holding a small, imperfectly sealed jar of the preserves, one she had set aside for herself. "Here," she said, her voice rusty from disuse. He took the jar without a word, his eyes wide. He twisted the lid, his small hands struggling for a moment before it gave with a soft pop. He dipped a finger inside and tasted it. A slow wonder dawned on his face. It was the sweetest thing he had ever known. He ran home with his prize. His father, Mr. Hemlock, saw the jar and scowled. "We don't take charity from that woman," he snapped, his pride stung by the gift. But Leo's mother, a tired woman worn thin by worry, took the jar. That evening, they ate the preserves on dry biscuits, and for a few moments, the taste of summer filled their bleak kitchen. The next day, Leo was back. He did not ask for more. Instead, he picked up the small axe by Elspeth's woodpile and began to methodically chop kindling. He worked with a quiet, fierce determination. When he was done, he stacked it neatly by her door and left. He came back every day after that. He weeded her garden. He hauled water. He fixed a loose board on her porch. They worked in a comfortable silence, a silent partnership forged over a shared secret. Elspeth would leave a small plate of bread and preserves for him, and he would leave behind a completed chore. He felt needed. She felt, to her own surprise, a little less alone. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch steps, sharing a biscuit, Leo looked at the cellar door. "What do you call it?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Elspeth looked at the jar in his hand, the amber contents glowing in the sun. "Peach preserves," she said simply. Leo shook his head. "No," he said, with the sudden, startling certainty of child. He pointed to the faint, silvery scars on the peach chunks visible through the glass. "It's from the storm. It's hailstone gold." Elspeth looked at him, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a genuine smile spread across her face. The name was perfect. It held the whole story, the ruin, the work, and the unexpected, beautiful result. "Yes," she said, "that's its name." By late July, the drought had its teeth in the valley. The creek was a dry, cracked scar on the land. The wells were getting low. The fields were a uniform, dusty brown. The bounty of a normal summer, fresh beans, ripe tomatoes, sweet corn, did not exist. There was only the heat, the dust, and the rising price of flour at Crofts Mercantile. One sweltering afternoon, a fine black carriage, the kind rarely seen in Providence, pulled up the road to Elspeth's cabin. The dust it kicked up hung in the still air for a long time. The driver, a man in a crisp uniform, got down and asked politely for water for his horses. Elspeth, with Leo's help, worked the pump of her well, which was thankfully deep and still drawing clear, and filled their trough. A man emerged from the carriage, fanning himself with a straw hat. He was dressed in city clothes, his face pale and beaded with sweat. He introduced himself as Chef Antoine Dubois of the Grand Hotel in the capital. He was on his way back from a fruitless trip, trying to source local produce for his kitchens. "There is nothing," he said, his voice carrying a French accent and a deep weariness. "The land is baked." Finished. As he spoke, a breeze shifted, carrying the scent from Elspeth's cabin. She had been simmering a small batch of preserves from a handful of wild plums she'd found. The chef stopped mid-sentence, his nostrils flaring. "What is that aroma?" he asked. "Cinnamon? Fruit?" Elspeth felt a surge of boldness she did not know she possessed. It was the drought, perhaps, or the quiet confidence that had been growing in her all summer. She went inside and returned with a fresh biscuit from her morning's baking and a small dish of the hailstone gold. "My own preserves," she said, offering it to him. Chef Antoine looked at the offering, his eyebrows raised. He was a man who commanded kitchens filled with gleaming copper and perfect ingredients. This was a humble, rustic thing, but he was a gracious man, and he took it. He spread the preserves on the biscuit and took a bite. A change came over his face. It was not a grand, theatrical reaction, but a quiet, profound stillness. His eyes closed. He chewed slowly, thoughtfully. The town of Providence had tasted failure in her purchase. Mr. Hemlock had tasted charity. Leo had tasted a sweet treat. Chef Antoine tasted the story. He tasted the bruising of the hail, which had concentrated the sugars. He tasted the ruthless knife that had carved away the rot, leaving only the defiant heart of the fruit. He tasted the kiss of cinnamon, the long, slow simmer. He tasted the patient, stubborn work of the hands that had made it. Mon Dieu, he whispered, his eyes opening. They were filled with a chef's reverence. This is not preserves. This is an elegy for a summer. It is magnificent. He looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time. Tell me, mademoiselle, how did you create such a thing from this blighted land? Elspeth, her heart pounding, told him the story. The hail, the crate, the mockery, the work. He listened, his head cocked, a look of growing respect on his face. When she was finished, he did not bargain or haggle. I will buy 12 jars, he said, and I will pay you $5 for each one. Elspeth stared at him. $60. It was more money than she had seen in a year. It was security. It was vindication. That is a fair price for an honest miracle, the chef said, mistaking her stunned silence for hesitation. I will take more, if you can spare them. My patrons, they will understand this taste. She sold him the 12 jars, her hands trembling slightly as she wrapped each one in cloth. He paid her in crisp bills, tucked them into a padded box, and was gone, leaving only a cloud of dust and the stunned silence of Elspeth and Leo standing by the well. The secret was out. August arrived like the open door of a furnace. The heat was a physical presence, pressing down on the valley, bleaching the color from the sky. The town's worry had curdled into something sharper, fear. The small gardens withered. The livestock grew thin. At Croft's Mercantile, the shelves grew barer, and the prices grew steeper. Silas Croft moved through his domain with a somber authority, talking of shared hardship while his ledger filled with new debts. He spoke of community spirit while charging $1 for a small bag of cornmeal that had cost 50 cents a month before. Hunger changes a town. It makes people suspicious. It turns neighbors into rivals. The news of the fancy city chef and his purchase traveled fast, as all news did in Providence. It became distorted in the telling, twisted by fear and envy. The story was no longer about Elspeth's hard work, but about her luck. She had stumbled into a windfall while everyone else suffered. She was hoarding her treasure, they whispered, a dragon sitting on a pile of golden jars in her cellar. The narrative had shifted again. The pity she had earned for her foolishness was gone. The respect she might have earned for her industry was twisted into resentment. Silas Croft heard the whispers, and he saw an opportunity. He arrived at Elspeth's cabin one afternoon, not in his work apron, but in his Sunday coat, as if on official business. He did not mock her now. His face was arranged in an expression of grave, paternal concern. Elspeth, he began, his voice smooth as butter. The town is talking. They say you've had some luck with those peaches. She stood on her porch, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. She said nothing, letting his words hang in the hot, still air. A young woman alone, he continued, leaning on the old, familiar refrain of her perceived weakness. You shouldn't be dealing with these city folk. They'll take advantage of you. And it doesn't look right. You holding on to all that sweetness while your neighbors are struggling, he let that sink in. It was a threat veiled as concern. I have a proposition for you. A way to help you and the community. You sell your preserves to me. All of them. I'll give you a fair price. Say, 30 cents a jar. I'll handle the distribution. Make sure everyone gets a little taste. It's the Christian thing to do 30 cents. After the chef had paid her $5, he wasn't offering to help. He was offering to steal her victory, to buy her hard-won success for pennies and sell it back to the town for dollars, positioning himself as the benevolent savior. He saw her as the same foolish girl who'd bought a crate of rotten fruit. He did not see the woman who had stood over a boiling pot for 3 days, who had done the brutal arithmetic of survival and won. Elspeth met his gaze with a calm, unnerving stillness. She did not argue. She did not defend herself. She simply disarmed his cruelty with a quiet fact. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice even and steady. "But I have it handled." The mask of concern on his face twitched. A flicker of anger, cold and hard, showed in his eyes before he could hide it. He had expected her to be grateful, or at least intimidated. Her quiet refusal was an unexpected obstacle. "You'll regret it," he said, his voice losing its buttery smoothness. "A person alone can't stand against the whole town." He turned and walked away, his back rigid with offense. The battle lines had been drawn. Elspeth stood on her porch and watched him go. "One person alone," he'd said. She looked over at her woodpile, where Leo was quietly and methodically stacking wood, and she knew it was not true. The whispers in town grew louder, sharper, fed by Croft's wounded pride. He didn't need to invent lies, merely to shape the existing fear. "She's hoarding," he would say to a customer, shaking his head sadly. "Got a cellar full of it, but won't part with a single jar. Not for a fair price, anyway. Waiting to gouge us when we're truly desperate. Being right is its own kind of reply, but it is a quiet one, easily drowned out by the noise of envy." The town, in its hunger and fear, began to believe him. The looks Elspeth received were no longer pitying or resentful, but openly hostile. She was the outsider, the selfish hoarder, the witch with a cellar full of enchanted gold she refused to share. One morning, she went to the cellar and found the heavy wooden latch broken, splintered from its frame. A cold dread washed over her. Inside, the lamplight revealed a scene of violation. The neat stacks of jars were in disarray. An entire wooden crate, one she had packed for the chef's next order, was gone. Footprints, larger than her own or Leo's, were visible in the thin layer of dust on the floor. He had not taken everything. He had been selective, taking the crate that was already packed, easy to carry. 30 jars, stolen in the night. A wave of fury, hot and clean, washed through her, followed by a surprising, resolute calm. She did not go to the sheriff. She knew who was behind this. The sheriff was in Croft's debt, like half the town. There would be an investigation that went nowhere, questions that were never answered. It would be her word against the most powerful man in town. Instead, she sat at her small kitchen table in the dark, the stolen jars a fresh wound in her careful accounting. She did the arithmetic. 37 jars made. 1 given to Leo. 12 sold to the chef. 30 stolen. That left her mind faltered. She had made more. After the first batch, she had bartered for more sugar and made a smaller second batch from the wild plums. She recounted. She lit the lamp and opened her ledger, a small book where she tracked every penny and every jar. The numbers were there, stark and clear. Total made, 62. Jars remaining before the theft, 49. Jars now, 19. 19 jars of sunlight to last her through the winter and fulfill her promise to the chef. She refused to despair. Despair was a luxury she could not afford. She adjusted the math. She would have to be more careful. She would have to be smarter. The next day, Leo arrived, his face pale and worried. "Mr. Croft has new preserves in his store," he said, his voice low. "He says they're special. From the city." Elspeth felt a cold certainty settle in her stomach. "What do they look like, Leo?" "They look like yours," he whispered. "And I saw one. It had a little chip on the lip of the jar. A tiny one. I remember it. It was the one I almost dropped when we were stacking them." Her eyes met his. The boy's quiet observation was more valuable than any sheriff's investigation. It was proof. She now had not only the knowledge of the crime, but the evidence of it, sitting on a shelf in the mercantile for all to see. Silas Croft, in his greed, had grown careless. He believed she was a woman alone, without allies, without recourse. He had underestimated both her and the quiet boy who saw everything. The next morning, Elspeth put on her best dress, a simple calico frock, and walked into town. She did not go to the sheriff's office. She walked directly into Croft's mercantile. The store was crowded. The heat had driven people inside, and the low hum of anxious conversation filled the air. They were talking about the drought, about their debts, about the coming winter. When Elspeth entered, a hush fell over the room. The townsfolk parted, creating a path to the counter, their faces a mixture of hostility and curiosity. Silas Croft stood behind it, polishing a glass. He looked up, and a flicker of surprise crossed his face, quickly replaced by his customary smugness. He thought she had come to beg, to accept his pitiful offer. "Elspeth," he said, his voice booming with false warmth. "Good to see you. Come to your senses, have you?" She ignored him. Her gaze swept over the shelves and landed on a small, proud display next to the cash register. There, on a velvet cloth, sat a dozen jars of hailstone gold. A small, hand-lettered sign read, "Imported preserves. From the East. $300. Elspeth walked to the counter and picked up one of the jars. She turned it over in her hands, the same way Mrs. Gable had turned over the bruised peach. It was Leo's jar, the one with the tiny, telltale chip on its rim. The confrontation was not what the town expected. There was no shouting, no hysterical accusation. Elspeth's power was in her stillness, in the unshakable quiet of her resolve. "These are lovely jars, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice clear and carrying through the silent store. "Very rare, you say?" Croft puffed out his chest, sensing a different kind of audience now. "The very best. Had to pull a lot of strings to get them here, what with the drought making everything so scarce. A special treat for my customers." He was performing, painting himself as the town's provider. Elspeth let him finish. Then she turned, not to him, but to the faces watching her. She addressed the room. "With the winter coming and times being so hard," she said, "I've decided to sell my own preserves. The ones I made from the miller's peaches." A murmur went through the crowd. This was what they had been waiting for, what Croft had told them she would never do. "I will be selling them to my neighbors," she continued, her eyes meeting those of Mrs. Hemlock, then another farmer's wife, then another. "I'll be selling them for 50 cents a jar, enough to cover my sugar and my time, and a little left over." A collective gasp. 50 cents. Croft was charging 6 times that amount for what they now suspected was the very same thing. The greed on his sign was suddenly obscene. The generosity of her offer was a stark, stunning contrast. Then she turned her calm, steady gaze back to Silas Croft. He looked pale, his composure cracking. She held up the jar with the chipped rim. "It's a funny thing, memory," she said, her voice conversational. 2 nights ago, I counted my jars before bed. I had 49, a good number. Yesterday morning, the latch on my cellar was broken, and I had 19. I had 212 peaches in that first crate, Mr. Croft. I remember the number exactly. It's the kind of thing you remember when you're cutting them up 1 by 1 inch." She leaned forward slightly. "How many jars of this imported preserve did you manage to get?" It was the perfect trap. Not an accusation, but a simple question. She had given him the rope, and now the whole town was watching to see if he would hang himself with it. His mind was racing, trying to calculate the lie. He didn't know that she knew the exact number stolen. He only knew he had to downplay it. I only have this 1 crate," he stammered. "A dozen jars. That's all they would sell me." He had fallen into it. A dozen. The town could do the arithmetic. 49 minus 19 is 30. He had a dozen on display. Where were the other 18? The question hung in the air, unanswered and unanswerable. His guilt was suddenly as plain as the dust on the floor, visible to everyone. The silence in the store was absolute. The spell was broken. The town's allegiance, so long held by Croft through credit and fear, snapped in an instant. It is easier to believe a thing is rotten than to admit you were wrong to mock it, but it is impossible to ignore greed when it is laid so bare. No one said a word. They simply began to move, 1 by 1, then in pairs. They turned their backs on Silas Croft and walked out of the mercantile, leaving him standing alone with his overpriced, stolen goods. The shame on his face was a dark, ugly blush. The crowd did not disperse. They reformed, a quiet, orderly line that stretched from Elspeth's cabin all the way down the dusty road. They came not with the hostility of the previous weeks, but with a humbled, hopeful quiet. They carried coins, or eggs, or promises of labor, ready to pay her fair price. The fortune inversion was complete. The farmers with their once-perfect fields had nothing but dust. The store owner with his full shelves had nothing but the town's contempt. And Elspeth, who had started with a crate of garbage, now held the key to the town's small comforts. She stood at her cellar door, with Leo beside her acting as a solemn gatekeeper, and sold her 19 jars. She could have asked for more. In their desperation, they would have paid $1 or even $2. The thought flickered, a temptation, but she dismissed it. Victory was not about profit. It was about this. It was about the look of profound relief on a mother's face as she clutched a jar that would mean a sweet treat for her children. It was about the quiet dignity of shared survival. Near the back of the line stood Mr. Hemlock. When his turn came, he could not meet her eye. His pride, so fierce and brittle, was broken by his family's need. He held out not a coin, but his calloused hands. "I don't have the 50 cents, he said, his voice thick with shame, "but I can mend your roof." A full day's work. Elspeth looked past him and saw Leo standing tall, watching them. She took a jar from her dwindling supply, one she had been saving for herself, and pressed it into Mr. Hemlock's hands. "There is no charge," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "Leo has already paid for it, many times over. He's a good boy, and a hard worker." Mr. Hemlock looked at his son, then back at Elspeth, and for the first time he saw her not as the foolish girl or the hoarding outsider, but as the woman who had saved a piece of the summer and who had just given him back his dignity in front of his child. He nodded, unable to speak, and walked away, his shoulders a little less slumped. When the last jar was sold, Elspeth was left with nothing for herself, and the 5 jars she had promised to Chef Antoine. The town was fed for a night. The lesson was learned. Her vindication was not a loud, triumphant thing. It was a quiet, warm feeling that settled deep in her bones. It was the trust in the eyes of her neighbors. It was the steady, solid presence of Leo, who had not left her side all day. It was the knowledge that she had been right, not just about the peaches, but about the choice to be generous when she could have been shrewd. That evening, as the sun set, painting the bruised sky in shades of peach and rose, she did not feel like one person alone. She felt like the heart of a community that was slowly, painfully learning to heal. Winter came, and it was hard. The drought had left the valley scarred and wanting. But it was not as bleak as it might have been. The single act of generosity at Elspeth's cellar door had rippled outward. Neighbors began to share what little they had. A sack of potatoes was traded for mending a coat. A cord of firewood was exchanged for a dozen eggs. The brittle suspicion that had taken root during the drought was replaced by a resilient, hard-won sense of community. Silas Croft's store remained open, but it was a changed place. The townsfolk bought only what they absolutely needed, their interactions clipped and cold. His power, built on the illusion of his benevolence, had vanished. He was just a man with a ledger, and they all knew the true accounting of his character. As promised, Chef Antoine returned in the spring. His fine carriage looked out of place in the muddy, thawing landscape. He had heard the story, the theft, the confrontation, the sale. He stepped out of his carriage and took Elspeth's rough, work-worn hands in his own. "You have the soul of a chef, mademoiselle," he said, his voice full of sincere respect. To understand that the finest ingredient is integrity, he bought the 5 jars she had saved for him, but he paid her double the agreed-upon price, insisting it was a fee for the lesson she had taught him about value. And then he offered her a contract, a standing order for the next year. Not just for hailstone gold, but for whatever she chose to create. "You have a gift," he told her. "This land speaks through you. I will buy whatever it has to say." Her future, which had once been a day-to-day calculation of survival, was now secure, built not on luck, but on her own 2 hands and the stubborn belief in a bruised thing. One afternoon, as the first green shoots were pushing their way through the soil, Elspeth stood with Mrs. Gable by the small orchard. The peach trees, dormant all winter, were covered in a delicate blush of pink blossoms. They held the promise of a new season, a new harvest. Leo was there too, no longer a silent observer, but a true partner, discussing his plans to build a better, sturdier cellar door. Mrs. Gable placed a warm, dry hand on Elspeth's arm, her touch as comforting as the spring sun. She looked from the blossoming trees to Elspeth's face, her faded denim eyes crinkling at the corners. "You see," she said, her voice a soft, knowing rumble. "God did not waste the bruised thing." She paused, and her gaze fell upon Elspeth's hands, which were resting on the fence rail. They were not the hands of a young girl anymore. They were strong, capable, marked with the small scars and calluses of her labor. He just waited, Mrs. Gable finished softly, for the right hands to find it. Elspeth looked down at her own hands. They had sorted and chopped, stirred and sealed, fought and provided. They had turned ruin into sustenance, scorn into respect. She was no longer defined by what she had lost, her father, her security, the town's approval. She was defined by what she had made, by the sweetness she had salvaged from the storm. The air was cool and clean, and it carried the scent of damp earth and peach blossoms, a perfume of beginning again.